Today we're going to talk about the new Stanford Hospital that's opening this fall as a $2 billion facility. And we're so pleased to have Dr. George Tingwald here. He's the Director of Medical Planning. You've worked on both the Lucile Packard Children's Hospital expansion and the new Stanford Hospital. So we're ready to pepper you with questions this morning about the whole process. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Let me ask you first about just how you got involved in this whole development and a little bit about your background.
I am a physician and an architect, and before coming to Stanford, I worked as the director of planning for hospitals and research facilities for Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, which is a large international architecture firm. So I worked on many major projects before coming to Stanford. As an example, I was the master planning lead at the Texas Medical Center, which is the largest medical center in the world.
Wow.
So I came to Stanford knowing it was a big project and really wanted to come and work on a project from pretty much day one and see a project all the way through. Most of my early career, I did the planning for a project and then passed that off. So I worked for 2 to 3 years on a project, and then other people took on the actual execution of the project. Here I've been involved from the very beginning of the projects, the planning, city approvals, all those other elements. Then much larger teams came involved, especially separation between the adult hospital teams and the children's hospital teams. But it's been really great for me to not only say this is the vision of what we should do, but actually see how you get there and what the impact is going to be. So this is my first real opening of a project.
Your baby.
This is really very special to me.
Yeah.
So you were a founding member of the Patient and Family Advisory Council, and that really involved the patients and families, and just in the design of or planning of the hospital. Can you talk a little bit about what the importance was, and what did you learn from them in terms of what the hospital should be?
Well, in coming to Stanford, I had done numerous other projects, and one of the first sort of diagnoses I did here was there were certain things that Stanford Hospital didn't have that were essential to me in developing the vision for a project. So two of the most interesting ones to me was that Stanford Hospital did not have a development office. So I didn't really understand how fundraising was going to happen. And we didn't have a patient advisory committee, which was essential to what I do. My passion is to engage patients and families in the design process of healthcare. And I've been instrumental in forming those organizations nationally, and it's what I'm all about. So that had to happen. And it did happen, but the fantastic thing that's happened since then, we started with 12 people. And now we have 500 people on our patient advisory councils. So they're various smaller groups for specialty areas or whatever, but we have the most active patient advisory group in the country. And it's to the level of detail now that we have a patient advisory member interviewing every medical student who's applying to Stanford. So we have engaged at the most basic level of who is going to respond and understand patients and families from the beginning.
And it sounds like this is something that isn't just in place only for the building of the hospital, but that it's now incorporated into the hospital.
It's now and forever. And they've gone from just being involved in planning and construction of buildings much further as their involvement in issues with the School of Medicine and operational issues. So this has been a huge transformation at Stanford. And it's one of the most educational moments for me. I mean, I've done this for a long time, and you say, I've seen everything, I've heard everything. That's not true. I see and hear things from patients and families every time I meet with them that comes as a surprise, as something that's not from my personal history. And that engagement, understanding is really key to what we're doing. But the hospital group was actually first but in a certain way, somewhat simpler. We've gotten much more complex over time. The Patient Advisory Committee for our Neuroscience Center, which involved people with many different neurologic disorders, and how do you create a building that responds to all of their various needs, but in the same environment? Now that's tough.
I was going to say.
But that's part of the passion for what we do.
Well, that sounds like it's really very complex, and I don't know if there's any one or two things that really jumped out that the old hospital was missing that the new hospital you really felt compelled to put into it.
Oh, there were so many things. And probably the first thing from the patient standpoint that was not about the building. It was that they wanted to be equal players at the table. They wanted to be treated like they were not an afterthought, that they were part of the team. And we did make them part of the team throughout the process. So that was the first thing.
That's a revolutionary change in perspective, isn't it?
It sure is.
Hospitals before weren't
in
incorporated.
1958 or 59, who did you talk to build a hospital? You talked to the doctors. Now, of course, we do talk to the doctors, and we have perspectives from that as being a doctor. But that's not the people. That is not the primary group we're serving. Okay.
And there are also differences. We talk about 1959 when the old hospital was built, and now we talk today. I mean, there must be tremendous change in the way you conceive of the hospital, what you put into it, maybe even who you've served. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's very, very different from that time in so many ways. The environment was much, much different. The number of people who were engaged in patient care was very, very different.
The population.
The population was very, very different, and especially at Stanford, which had a history of the hospital being in San Francisco. And when it came to Palo Alto in the 50s, I don't know if you know the history of this, but it was a combination of this one little wing of a 3-story building, which was Stanford Hospital, and the other wing was the Palo Alto Hospital.
I didn't know that.
So they brought the community hospital and the university hospital together. So many things have changed since that time. But a couple of things were really futuristic during the planning of that hospital back in the 50s. Patient rooms on the first floor had outdoor garden space. There was an interest in using the environment of Palo Alto, our great weather, our views, our daylight, our sunshine, as part of that process. So some of that stuff was there that many people think, oh, well, that's kind of new concept stuff. No, a lot of that environmental stuff was there initially, but the technological side has changed so much. And one of the examples we use, just things that happened, the emergency department was originally planned for about 10,000 visits a year. And the new hospital is planned for 100,000 visits a year. So there's just very significant changes in what the hospital was, what the environment was. But we worked with a really interesting first hospital to emulate and try to keep all the good things about it.
You said that this hospital is built for 100 years. Now, the most interesting thing to me is how could you possibly predict what the hospital is going to need in order to serve patients, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And when you started, that was 10 years ago, you got the approvals. Even things then are different now. I mean, I can imagine there are things that seemed like they were futuristic then, but are perfectly commonplace.
So it's a whole part of our industry right now that studies this idea, which we call future-proofing.
Future-proof.
But how do you really plan for a building to allow for that amount of change? And the first thing you do is set sort of the parameters of things you know are probably not going to change, and settle those things. So as an example, just from the patient issue, we have the new hospital is an all-private room hospital. I think that's the end of, we went from wards to 4-bedded rooms to 2-bedded rooms to 1. So we think an all-private room hospital is a 100-year decision. It's not, that piece we're pretty settled with. The structural system for the building which is very, very sophisticated, is there to handle an earthquake of up to a magnitude of 8.0 and hopefully beyond that, but that's what it's designed to. We hope that earthquakes are not going to be regular events that are higher than an 8.0. So we think from a structural standpoint, we've got a building that will hold up, which is what our 50-year-old building is not capable of doing. And then the sizes of rooms, we oversized many rooms in the building for 10 years ago, knowing that equipment and some technology issues were going to get bigger. We knew some might get smaller, but so we planned for those things, and then actually how we organize the building itself is to allow for that level of change and flexibility. So like to me, I'm a surgeon. The most significant design innovations in the building are on the second floor of the building in what's called the interventional platform. But those rooms are designed to change the equipment in the room without changing the infrastructure of the room.
That's the OR
Yes,
suites and
right.
MRI machines and
Yeah.
things. Okay.
So as an example, in an older hospital, and just how hot medicine was set up, cardiac cath labs were over there in the cardiac cath world, and cardiac operating rooms were over here in the operating world. But now we're replacing heart valves through catheters, not by open surgical procedures. So how do you handle that piece? You want those two room typologies next to each other, which now an interventional platform does that. All of our procedural space is combined in the same platform. But it also means when we're not opening up chests for doing these procedures, and we want it to go to interventional, which requires imaging and other services, we can add that imaging services into that OR. So we're not moving the room, we're moving the technology. And that actually saves 10 years of design and planning time. So a lot of the stuff we're planning in this building is to allow for changes that we know are going to happen and to settle the issues finally on the ones that we know are probably not going to change. Okay?
Right. I was thinking, when I think about these types of nimble things that you build into the building, I'm thinking about like moving a wall. But that's not what you're saying. You're saying it's basically you're able to just rehook up whatever you need in the building. If you need to bring in new equipment,
Right.
you can do that.
Yeah, now there may be walls that move over time or whatever, but the basic framework of the building, we think, allows for that flexibility and adaptability. We can change an intensive care room into an acute care room or vice versa without replanning the room or moving it from one place to another. Mm-hmm. So a lot of that is just the initial concept of what we're trying to do. We're not saying, here's the problem from 10 years ago and let's solve it with the solutions of that time. Mm-hmm. We aren't building a 10-year-old building.
Mm-hmm. That was the other question I had. I mean, this has been, 12 years in the planning?
Yes.
So, I mean, you mentioned earlier when we were off camera about just the whole idea that technology has changed so much that when the building was started, it was at the same time that the iPhone was essentially introduced. So technology has moved so rapidly. And how do you kind of build that? How do you build that in? I mean, how did you prepare as you were going along and say, oh my goodness, we started with this concept 12 years ago, but now it's already obsolete. So how much of that played into what you had to work with?
So in the world of future-proofing and how this works, I'll give you two examples. Let's say in the operating room area, we knew that the equipment we couldn't plan for 10-year-old equipment.
Right.
So we worked out with our state regulatory groups or whatever that we phased the approvals of the building. So that the last two areas, only 2 years ago, we got approvals for our operating rooms and our imaging department because we wanted to bring in the latest equipment. So part of that was just in the planning of the building to say, okay, what do we do early and what do we defer? The entire, most of the IT component, especially related to the interactions of family members with staff, et cetera, we provided the space for that. And at the beginning, we wrote some guiding principles that said, this is what we want to achieve. But we had no idea how we were going to achieve that. So we knew that was going to happen, and so we're there. But I think the issue is there will still be changes over time. We've actually changed out equipment in the building to upgrade before we opened.
Well, it was interesting to me that initially we were told that there were going to be 76 single patient rooms in the ER, for example, and now that's gone to 66 because they decided that basically they had to move, have a separate pediatric ER that would better serve patients, adult patients and children. So isn't that, I mean, that was just like a little while ago, right? So it's like this changeover happens so rapidly. It's what's fascinating.
We're responding to the needs of the community. The issue with emergency departments has changed significantly over the last few years. When we originally planned the ED for this hospital, we planned what's called soft space next to it. So we planned space for another amount of growth. We actually built that out on day one. And now the issue is we're trying to respond to what we perceive may be issues, and the decision has been made to look at least utilizing our existing emergency department rather than closing it, see how that works. That may not be the final solution to how all of emergency care happens, but we are responding to all those things. So yeah, it's a constant battle, but we're ready for it. People say, what didn't we foresee? I think in technology now, one of the things we haven't perceived is the amount of power and data that some of these new things take. The next generation of radiology equipment, it weighs less. It's obviously the same size because people are people. That piece, but it could have gotten bigger, but it didn't. But now it requires 10 times the amount of electric power as it did with the next generation. So it's sort of like, yikes, that is something we really did not understand at the time.
Yeah.
So we're catching up.
Where does the power come from, or where can you put additional sources within the
And
infrastructure?
if you have computers, you have to figure in how much data you need, and data storage and things like that. So we talk about also the ER. This is such a big component, the Stanford being a trauma center, a regional trauma center. And it seems like it was pretty impressive to go out there and look even at the bay, where the ambulance bays, and see that essentially they've doubled the number of ambulances they can handle. But then when there's a real disaster, they have space outside of the bay itself for 20 ambulances. So, it seems like there's just, if you maybe could speak a little bit about how we're prepared for the big one, or whatever it is we have, some sort of mass casualty.
Yeah, so we were very fortunate in that a large national study went on right after 9/11 called the ER1 study. And so an enormous amount of research was being done and planning on a national level that we engaged in. We became part of that group, and so we learned a lot from that. And I think what you're talking about we call scalability, which you hear about in tech industry all the time. But how do you work in an ER on 1x, which is a regular day? How do you do 2, 3, 4x plus? So all of that was put into the planning process. So our actual rooms for the emergency department, though they're all for individual patients, when you look at that 66 number, those rooms are actually individually big enough in a major emergency to handle 2 patients. So we have a 2 to 2.5 to 3x we can handle even within the department itself. And in certain areas like our trauma base, which I think you've seen, they're enormous. They're for 1 patient, but we can handle 4 patients in that space if we need to. So that's that first level of scalability. And then we get into 4x, 5x scalability. And what we did is we located a parking structure directly next to the emergency department. So we have a built structure that we can move our higher X things right into. So if we have a mass event or whatever, we're not building tents and infrastructure and where's the water coming from and where's the power coming from and gases or whatever, that parking structure has the infrastructure to handle that kind of issue.
So you're saying that you just mentioned, so water supplies are in the parking garage?
We have decontamination showers
Yeah,
in the
okay.
garage. Yeah.
Right.
So you go and park there, whatever. You wonder what this is. Well, in the case of that, there are no cars in that area, and
Sure.
we utilize that service. But we also do that on a day-to-day basis. So in the flu season or whatever, we don't like patients who maybe have flu, which is a very infectious issue, to be sitting in our waiting room. So we do something called the drive-through ER, which Stanford was one of the groups that founded this. But in those situations, we can go out and triage patients in their cars. And if they need to be admitted, we have ways to admit them through decontamination areas directly into the emergency department versus coming to the public waiting room areas. So we've tried to utilize every element of the new construction to its best possible purposes. And probably one of the most complex ones, logistically, was the emergency department. But we had lots of resources from the national groups. And we are the level 1 trauma center between here and San Jose, so we know this is going to happen and we're ready for it.
I know some people don't want to go to the ER specifically because of the reasons that you were talking about, the contamination, spread of illness. So I see that you've anticipated a lot of that. Are there design techniques that hospitals are using today to reduce things like staph infection? Because some people are also afraid of staying too long in a hospital and getting other kinds of illnesses.
Yes, so hospital-acquired infections are a major deal. Most of that work, the most effective elements are very specific at the patient bedside. Hand washing, techniques of changing dressings and lines and other sorts of things. And we are at the forefront of all of that. But from the design standpoint of the rooms and the buildings, yes, we are looking at materials that are extremely cleanable and trying to respond on a research basis because the bugs are changing fast. And we're trying to respond to how do you deal with that issues. So a number of things have changed even in this process of fabrics, furniture, other sorts of elements. We are having to bring in things that the new cleaning materials are not going to eat. There was a whole movement a few years ago about sort of greening hospitals and using more sustainable products, which many people thought would be organic products, and they would be biodegradable. Well, they've also proven to be exactly what the bugs want for dinner. So we're responding to those issues of cleanliness and have begun that, and a lot of that work is already done before the opening of the hospital.
Okay. We're going to need to wrap up soon. Sue, did you have a final question?
No, I think I'm set. I did most of the talking in this one. Go right ahead.
Well, I appreciate your time, and I will be at a little booth this weekend.
Okay, we've got community days on Saturday and
community
Sunday.
days Saturday and Sunday. We have a booth called Ask the Expert, and I'm one of those
that's
experts.
terrific.
So if you have more questions, come by and see us.
Sounds
Great,
very good.
Thank you.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Behind the Headlines. If you want to read the Stanford Hospital story that Sue wrote, it's on our cover, and you can pick up an edition on the news racks or go to paloaltoonline.com. We'll see you next week.